predstavnici medija, dragi kolege.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of the press, dear colleagues, welcome to the presentation of the November Inflation Report, where we will present our views of the recent and future macroeconomic developments which dictate our monetary and macroprudential policy decisions. I would like to begin by underlining what I believe to be the key takeaways from this conference. Based on data and analysis which we will present to you today, as well as the estimates of all relevant international institutions keeping an eye on Serbia's economic policy, we may conclude unambiguously that the Serbian economy has shown significant resilience to the adverse events in the international environment. This is confirmed by the following: dynamic economic growth, which in cumulative terms and inclusive of this year will exceed the pre-pandemic level by more than 18%. Established downward trajectory of inflation and its anticipated movement within the bounds of the target tolerance band throughout the projection horizon, that is, over the next 2 years. Sustainable public finance and fortified external position of the country, and record high FX reserves exceeding all the criteria used for assessing their adequacy. The obtainment of an investment-grade rating from Standard & Poor's, one of the 3 leading global rating agencies, and the successful conclusion of the 4th review of the precautionary arrangement with the IMF, further supports the above achievements, together with the agreement on a new advisory non-financial policy coordination instrument. Serbia has received its first ever investment-grade rating. With its most significant expected positive effects, including more favorable financing conditions for both the government and the private sector, as well as Serbia's increased recognizability on the global investment map. This has fulfilled one of the key strategic objectives of the National Bank of Serbia and the government for this year. Therefore, in our report, in the first text book, you will have, I believe, an exceptional analysis of the impact of credit rating, not only on Serbia and not only until today, but also going forward. We will now briefly lay out the current economic developments, our new macroeconomic projections and monetary policy decisions taken in the period since the previous report. As is our practice, and given that price stability is our main objective and the benchmark of success, I shall start with inflation. After returning within the target tolerance band of 3 ± 1.5% in May, year-on-year inflation continued to move within its bounds over the following months, measuring 4.5% in October. Relative to the peak from March last year, inflation was set on a downward path by all of its key components, most of all food prices, whose year-on-year growth since February this year has been constantly lower than headline inflation. Core inflation also recorded a sharp fall in the same period, coming down from more than 11% in March last year to less than half that number, and trending at around 5% year-on-year over the past months. The level of inflation in the previous months was in line with the projection from the August report, as well as with our projection from a year ago, which you can read about in more detail in one of the text boxes in the November report. And Mr. Savo Jakovljević will share a few more words on that. Due to the negative effects of the drought, the October inflation outturn was slightly higher than anticipated. According to our new central projection, inflation will continue to move within the target tolerance band over the next 2 years, namely over our projection horizon. In the coming period, year-on-year inflation should gradually slow down and approach the target midpoint around the end of next year. The largest contribution to such inflation movements will come from the still restrictive monetary conditions, anchoring of not only medium-term but also of short-term inflation expectations within the target bounds, as well as lower imported inflation and the fall of global oil prices, which is expected based on the futures. In addition, we expect real wages to grow in line with productivity, helping core inflation decline and approach the headline rate. Relative to the previous projection, the negative effects of the drought on the supply and prices of fruits and vegetables are stronger, and domestic demand has been rising slightly faster. However, we estimate that this will mostly be offset by a lower global oil price, provided that it moves in line with the futures, and partly also by subdued imported inflation in the conditions of slower than anticipated recovery in the euro area. Taking all this into account, our headline inflation projection for next year is almost unchanged from August. In the real sector, I would like to underline that as positive dynamics in most production and service sectors extended into the third quarter, we kept our GDP growth projection for 2024 at 3.8%. This year's GDP growth would probably be even higher were it not for the negative effects of the drought on agricultural output and electricity production in hydropower plants. Let me remind you that as a result of the regular major 5-year revision, GDP growth for 2023 was revised up again to 3.8%. One of the text boxes looks into the details of the revision, as well as its effects on economic growth and the GDP shares of key macroeconomic indicators. And we will also touch on it today as well. As before, we expect economic activity to accelerate further in the next 2 years to the range of 4 to 5%, with a central value of 4.5%. The composition of growth for this year changed slightly from August in favor of higher domestic demand growth. Private consumption is expected to provide the largest positive impulse in the current and the coming years, thanks to a rise in employment and wages, preserved consumer confidence, and living standards of our citizens. Serbia has been awarded investment-grade rating as an additional confirmation that investment confidence has been preserved. Therefore, fixed investments will continue to provide robust support to GDP growth. This will also be propped up by the implementation of investments planned under the Leap into the Future Serbia Expo 2027 program. We believe that further growth in investment, expected to exceed 25% of GDP over the next 2 years, will be supported by the generally receding global inflationary pressures and improved financing conditions. The potential for investment will also benefit from high corporate profitability in previous years and by FDI inflows. As investment and personal consumption are expected to gather momentum, we project that imports will rise faster than exports in 2024 and the coming years, resulting in a negative contribution of net exports, which will decline year after year. Other relevant international institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund, Consensus Economics, World Bank, etc., have similar expectations of economic growth and for its structure for 2024 and beyond, placing it among the highest in Europe. In the 9 months of the year, Serbia's external position is marked by growth in both export and import of goods and services, though with a faster year-on-year growth in imports of 8.5% than in exports of 4.3%. Within goods exports, despite persistently weak external demand, manufacturing exports continued up at a rate of around 3% year-on-year, owing to past investment. Agricultural exports also rebounded thanks to high autumn crop yields from 2023. Growth in imports was driven by the import of equipment for capacity modernization and the ongoing investment cycle, and partly by the import of consumer goods and tourist services due to higher disposable income of households. Despite widening, the current account deficit was more than fully covered by FDI inflow. The foreign direct inflow to Serbia in the first 9 months of the year amounted to 3.6 billion euros, or 3.9 billion euros inclusive of preliminary October data. Consequently, appreciation pressures prevailed this year as well, with the MBS turning out as the net FX buyer in the international foreign exchange market in the first 10 months, having purchased 1,990 million euros in the first 10 months. So we have already exceeded 2 billion euros in November. As a result, the country's FX reserves at 28.3 billion euros at end October exceeded all adequacy metrics, representing an important pillar of defense against external risks. As the investment cycle is expected to gather momentum, the current account deficit is projected at around 4.7% of GDP this year and around 5% in the next 2 years, which is within the bounds of external sustainability. The favorable external position will also be sustained by the high inflow of FDI, which is broad-based in terms of both geography and project, and is expected to stay at around the last year's level. The acceleration of Serbia's economic growth on account of investment and productivity growth, also supported by FDI inflow, ought to push up potential output and speed up the process of Serbia's real convergence to the EU. We draw your attention to one text box in this report, in which we empirically confirm that the credit rating upgrade, reflecting the government's and the MBS's results on the macroeconomic stability plane, most certainly contributes to growing FDI inflow. This year witnessed the continuation of favorable fiscal trends, with the surplus in the year to September reaching 29.1 billion dinars. The better-than-expected result can be attributed to revenue overperformance, reflecting favorable labor market trends and higher than initially assessed profitability of domestic corporates in the last year. The created fiscal space was used to boost public investment, particularly in transport, energy and utility infrastructure, which is expected to remain at around 7.3% of GDP in the coming years. Although the medium-term fiscal framework envisages a more expansionary fiscal policy to support investment planned under the Leap into the Future Serbia Expo 2027 program, we deem that this will not undermine the declining public debt to GDP ratio, which measured 46.8% at end September, significantly below the Maastricht criterion of 60%. Based on all that was previously said, I believe that we have clearly ensured the so-called soft landing of our economy after strong shocks coming from the international environment, and that now, amid reduced inflationary pressures and inflation moving within the bounds of the target, we are able to support more favorable conditions and sources of credit growth, and thus also additionally support economic growth. In the third quarter, lending to the non-monetary sector picked up further year-on-year to 6.6% in September, driven by the rise in both corporate and household lending. Lending acceleration was also supported by the expected and initiated monetary policy easing by the MBS and the ECB, and by softened bank credit standards. Lending growth, along with a lower amount of NPLs, resulted in a decline in the NPL ratio in total loans to its new record low of 2.7% in August, where it remained in September as well. Owing to a robust bank regulatory framework and well-calibrated and synchronized monetary and macroprudential policy measures, the NPL ratio was kept close to 3% throughout the current multidimensional crisis, with the degree of dinarization of corporate and household receivables going up to 36.8% in September. Being responsible monetary policy makers, we are aware that caution is still needed given the numerous challenges, unpredictable macroeconomic developments in the international environment, and mounting geopolitical tensions. With this in mind, and recognizing the need to assess the effects of past monetary policy easing, after reducing the key policy rate by 25 basis points at 3 meetings, in each meeting since mid-year to 5.75%, we kept it unchanged in October and November. I would like to emphasize now that, according to our estimate, monetary policy remains restrictive despite the easing, helping keep inflationary pressures low in the period ahead. An important factor in maintaining the restrictiveness of our monetary policy, and also a confirmation of its high credibility, are the lower inflation expectations, which, in case of the financial sectors, are within the inflation target band both 1 year ahead and in the medium term. We will make monetary policy decisions cautiously, on a meeting-to-meeting basis, depending on the pace of inflation slowdown and movement of its key factors, mindful of the effects on financial stability and economic growth. The aim of our measures is to ensure the best possible support to economic growth by delivering price stability and relative exchange rate stability, thereby contributing to greater business certainty, a more favorable investment climate, as well as higher employment and living standards for our citizens. At the same time, by preserving financial stability, we enable a stronger feedback loop between the financial and real sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the results achieved did not come overnight. My colleagues also say they were not a gift from God, but I say yes, they have been achieved with God's help, but they had to be earned through a well-thought-out and responsible economic policy. The MBS had a clear mandate, was independent in choosing instruments of action, and exercised effective coordination with the government and constructive cooperation with the financial sector. Only in this way could it successfully respond to numerous external challenges while preserving macroeconomic stability and prospects for dynamic economic growth, which are key factors for employment as well as the security and stability of our citizens' incomes. Moreover, the MBS strives to further ease the financial situation for citizens during these turbulent times and to protect them from potential sudden market disruptions. Closing my speech, I would like to remind you that with this goal in mind, we capped the interest rate on euro-indexed housing loans for first-time home buyers last year, thus taking a preemptive action to safeguard financial stability. We are now preparing legal solutions aimed at capping the maximum interest rates which banks can offer on some categories of household loans. This will help increase citizens' disposable income while further strengthening the transmission of monetary policy measures through the interest rate channel. In the remainder of the conference, our colleagues from the Economic Research and Statistics Department will present our projections in more detail, and after that, we are here for your questions. Thank you for your attention and your patience.
Thank you, Madam Governor. We will now provide some details relating to the inflation projection and the assumptions we used in making this projection. As the Governor pointed out, our new inflation projection is quite similar to the previous one, so we expect inflation to continue to move within the bounds of the target tolerance band and approach the target midpoint of 3% late in the year. We have similar factors behind such inflation movements, tight monetary conditions, which are continuing to be so, lower imported inflation and lower inflation expectations, and they're anchoring within the target tolerance band, and the contribution of oil futures, which are expected, according to which oil prices will continue to go down despite all uncertainty. It is important to point out imported inflation. I will now provide some details on our assumptions. A better outturn regarding imported inflation is that inflation in the euro area will also decline in the coming period. Average inflation for this year is expected in the euro at 2.3%, and in 2025 and 26 it will be around 1.9%. A good thing is that the continued decline in euro area inflation will be guided by a wider group of products which are included in core core inflation, whereas in the prior period in the euro area as well, the decline in inflation was led by the decline in energy prices. When it comes to external demand, that is movement in the real sector in the euro area, which is our most important trade partner, we assumed some acceleration in economic activity growth in the euro area. For this year, this is still a modest 0.7%. GDP growth in the euro area. In 2025 it will be 1.2%, and in 2026 it will be 1.5%. So in the euro area there will also be some acceleration of economic activity. When it comes to domestic demand, in the coming period, its growth will be affected by the increased profitability of the corporate sector, which creates possibilities for investment to domestic companies, then high FDI inflows, employment and wage growth, growth in the capital expenditure of the government. When it comes to oil, I have already mentioned this, we based our assumptions on futures. At the end of this year, the global oil price should be around $75 per barrel. What we see now is that it has leveled off, stabilized at around $72 per barrel. It ranged between $70 and $80 over the past month, depending on how global uncertainties affected this oil price. There has been some volatility, but for the time being, it is not such that it could disrupt global flows or energy prices and petroleum product prices at home. Specifically, in the coming period, we'll look at the groups of the products that will contribute to a decline in inflation. Going forward, we expect the prices of the group of non-food products and services. This is a broader group that is partly included in core inflation, so we expect the contribution of these products to start declining in the coming period in the projection horizon, and that the contribution of this group will decline from 2.2 percentage points at present to around 1.5 percentage points until the end of the projection horizon. The factors behind the fall in the prices of these products and services, so in part, this refers to imported inflation, which I have already explained, but also to global supply chains pressures, which are diminishing despite all uncertainties. Also, container transport prices, which we have pointed out for a long time as a factor behind price growth. So these costs have also declined now. When it comes to food prices, we expect a mild decline in their contributions, so from 1 percentage point at present to 0.8 percentage points. But what is important to note, and as the governor has emphasized in her introduction, so we had the effects of the drought this year, and they changed somewhat the structure of our projection. So this is the reason why in recent months we have had slightly higher inflation outturns than we expected. Here I will emphasize vegetable prices, which had an important monthly growth in September and October, which was 6.5% in September and 5.2% in October. So if we look at their year-on-year effect of the year-on-year growth rate was 6.7 in October. So this is where we will feel the effects of the drought during the summer months until the end of this year and early next year, and we will have a positive contribution from vegetable prices to headline inflation. It will range from 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points, and the entire fruit and vegetables group will contribute between 0.4 and 0.5 percentage points. With the arrival of the next agricultural season, which we assume that will be average from mid-2025 and in the final quarter and early 2026, we ought to have a negative contribution to inflation. That is, we expect these prices to go down 1 year from now, also because of the high base that we have now. All in all, the inflation projection is quite similar. It is practically the same as in August, but within the inflation projection, the structure has been changed a little. When it comes to average inflation for next year, we expect 3.7% next year. We expected 3.6% in the previous projection, so this is practically the same level. I will now refer to the text box which analyzes deviation of actual inflation from that projected a year ago. You have more details in the inflation report. This is a projection from the November inflation report from 1 year ago. And if we look here, if we look at the outturn of the inflation, actual inflation was quite close to what we projected at that time. In the final quarter of last year and the first 2 quarters of this year, we even had lower inflation than we projected in November. It is only in the 3rd quarter we have somewhat higher inflation. We projected it at 4.1 and it was 4.3. So it is not a large deviation if we look at the downward deviations, and this was mostly due to the drought that we experienced during the summer months. And on this slide, you can see that if you compare this with other countries of the region, the deviations of our inflation projection are either similar or even lower than compared to other central banks which are pursuing a similar inflation monetary policy regime. Thank you, Sava. We will now provide some more details regarding the GDP projection for this and the next year. As Madam Governor has pointed out, our projection of GDP growth for this year is still 3.8%. We also expect over the next 2 years that real GDP growth will range between 4 and 5%, with a central value at 4.5%. But there has been a change in the structure by sectors within this projection compared to the August projection. First of all, when we discuss economic growth from the production side, the largest contribution this and the next year is expected to come from the service sectors. We estimate this contribution at cumulatively speaking from the service sectors, we assess the contribution at 2.6%, from 2 to 4 percentage points. We will have a positive contribution of net taxes, 0.5 percentage points. We also expect an important contribution from industry, from its manufacturing part, and it will be around 0.6 percentage points this year. A positive contribution will also come from the construction sector in view of the implementation of infrastructure projects and the start of the projects relating to the Leap into the Future Serbia Expo 2027 program. So the only negative contribution will come from the agricultural sector, and it is slightly higher than we had in our August projection, having in mind the negative effects of the drought during the summer months. But we believe that this has been offset by higher than expected growth in the industry sector, as I said, specifically in the manufacturing part, whereas drought has partly reflected on lower production in the energy sector because the hydropower declined. So there was reduced production from hydropower plants. Despite this decreased production in agriculture, we estimate that there is enough production to satisfy domestic needs, and we also have high inventories taken over from last year, so we do not expect export of agricultural products to be threatened in any way. Assuming that the next agricultural season will be average, we would practically from the next year on, we expect to see a positive contribution of all sectors. From the expenditure side, by contrast to last year when growth was guided by net export, this year growth in GDP is guided by domestic demand. We now estimate that we have higher growth in investment and consumption than in our last projection, and therefore import is rising also somewhat higher than we expected. So we have a slightly higher contribution of domestic demand and a slightly more negative contribution of net export than in our previous projection. Within domestic demand, the most important contribution comes from household consumption because they have the largest share in the structure of GDP. Around 2.8 percentage points is what we expect this year. And this is supported by the trends in the labor market, continued rise in employment and wages, particularly in the private sector, and also the slowing of inflation. Also, we expect to see the effects of our monetary policy easing, which will result in higher lending to the household sector. Another important contribution of around 2 percentage points or slightly above that is also expected to come from investment in fixed investment, where this year we estimate that there will be an almost equal contribution of private and public investments. So private investments will have a slightly higher contribution, and from next year we expect that the contribution of private investment will be higher than public investment. As Madam Governor pointed out, we expect total investment, both private and public, to exceed the level of around 25%, which is seen as desirable for countries of our level of development, but that government investment will be that their share in GDP will be around 7.3, 7.4% on average in the coming period. Investment growth is certainly supported by the implementation of important infrastructure projects in transport, energy, utility infrastructure, and also the maintenance of and also the hosting of Expo 2027. The sources of funding investment are higher profitability of corporates, higher inflows from foreign direct investments. Also, I already mentioned capital outlays of the government, and having in mind the initiated easing of our monetary policy and of the monetary policy of the European Central Bank, we also expect investment loans to contribute to investment growth in the coming period. The contribution of net export will be negative in this year and beyond, but we estimate that this negative contribution will diminish. Export of goods and services continues up, and this is supported by past investment and by increased export capacities, which were supported by foreign direct investments, which were mostly directed into tradable sectors. But because investments and personal consumption are going up, import has been rising at a faster pace than exports since the start of the year, and therefore we have the negative contribution. From next year, since we expect some rallying of external demand, we expect exports to pick up as well. So this negative contribution of net exports should be somewhat lower than we estimated during this year. Finally, I will mention that the Serbian Statistical Office has published information about a third quarter growth of 3.1% year-on-year, which is consistent with our previous estimate. So in that sense, we believe that the outturn of this projection of 3.8% is realistic. Similar projections have also been given by other international institutions. They expect our growth to be almost the highest in Europe.
Thank you. I would like to follow up to our GDP projection from the stance of the recently implemented revision of the data that was implemented a month ago. This is something we do every 5 years with the aim of improving the national account system, and the improvement of the methodology for GDP calculation is an integral part of that. These amendments have been done in line with methodological instructions and the Eurostat's program, and they are done by all countries in Europe, which helps us make these data comparable across Europe. Specifically in Serbia, of the most significant improvements, they relate to the sources of data used, and these are the population census from 2022, the agricultural census from 2023, and we have also improved the scope of data on entrepreneurs and local units of business entities. What are the results of the review? The review has been done, has been done on data from 1995 to 2023. The largest amendments pertain to 2023, where, as the governor has already mentioned, real growth has been revised up from 2.5 to 3.8%, while in the nominal amount, GDP was increased from 8,150 billion dinars to 8,818 billion dinars, which in euros is from 69.5 billion to 75.2 billion euros. As a result, there has been a change in the share of all key macroeconomic indicators in GDP, and the biggest changes have been recorded with debt indicators. And so the share of the general government public debt in GDP at the end of 2023 has been trimmed from 52% to 48.1%, while the share of Serbia's external debt has been reduced from 65.3% to 60.4%. Also, to a smaller extent, there has been a downward revision of indicators of the share of the current account deficit and the deficit of the general government in GDP by 2 percentage points, and for 2023 they now stand at 2.4 and 2.1%. All of this further speaks in favor of our stance that our economic fundamentals were stronger and better, and that the investment grade that we were granted in October was most likely earned much earlier. I would also like to mention the changes in the GDP structure by production sector and aggregates in 2023, where we see that the biggest revision in terms of production sectors was implemented in the services sector, where in 2023 it was raised from 2 to 5.1%, and this is probably the bulk of contribution of our upwards revision of GDP. And within the services sector, retail and wholesale trade stand out, and their real growth from minus 1.4 was revised to 4.4%. And in the information and communication sectors, where growth was estimated at 8%, now we have a 14.1% growth. And the share of this sector in GDP creation has been lifted from 5.3 to 8.2%. In terms of the aggregates, the biggest changes in 2023 was recorded in fixed investments. Real growth has been increased from 3.9 to 9.7%, and this is a result of a more comprehensive inclusion of aggregates in agriculture and housing, which is a direct consequence of the data we obtained from the censuses that have been implemented. These changes are also relevant in terms of the growth projection for this year in the services sector. Their share has been increased, and this makes our GDP growth projection of 3.8% in this year very likely. We are now open for your questions, if you have any. Ivan Mirčević, Euronews. What does this mean for the food prices, and what can we expect as the government campaign, the best price, wraps up? Can we look to some price hikes? And the second question, if I should ask it right away, can we sum up if there's an area where we will see hikes in prices? What are your projections? As for food prices, we have just said this during the projection. The biggest effect is the effect of the drought in terms of fruit and vegetable prices, which is visible in inflation. That their contribution was a bit higher than what we had in the August projection. And this effect will be felt for a few more months going forward, but not to the extent when we had in previous droughts. We don't expect such growth in these prices, such as in 2022. So the effects of the drought on fruit and vegetable prices will be felt this year and at the start of next year. But as the first yields next year come in, this effect will be dissipated. So we expect next year's prices to be lower than today. As for other food prices, we expect them to stabilize. In this group, as I said, non-food products and services, which have an even higher contribution than before. Services are having a higher contribution, and they should stabilize over the coming months. And as the months of this year we drop out of the calculation, these prices will also decline. And year-on-year inflation will also go down. This is the principle on which it functions. And do we expect price growth? No, we do not to any larger extent. Only what I said in terms of fruit and vegetables. As for other products, we do not expect that.
I would like to add we do not expect particular growth in any products to the measure in which we, as domestic actors, the National Bank of Serbia and the government can influence. We even expect a decline in some prices which had unjustified growth. As is my usual custom, I would like to say that wholesalers and retailers, I would not like them to they should cooperate with the government. They should respect the fact that it is the job of the government to prevent cartel and monopolizing behavior. I would like to remind all of you of this. I'm sure my associates already know this, but I will tell you how this struggle for monopoly began in 1983, when Ronald Reagan took power in 1983. Instead of protecting the Federal Trade Commission and maintaining its powers, this Federal Commission, the number of its employees went from 435 to 135, and a clear message was sent that the work of the Commission that is in charge of preventing monopolistic and cartel behavior should that its work should be wrapped up in a way. And when those who are elected by the powerful and the mighty wish to repay their debt to them, so the idea was to achieve a synergy between big companies And the law on the protection of intellectual property was adopted at the same time to support this. So now you may wonder what is the connection between the struggle against competition and this law on the protection of intellectual property. And here we had protection of the monopoly through this talk of maximum synergy. Through the protection of intellectual property, big companies and their brand names were protected. And a small family shop of an old Irishman whose surname was McDonald's, but who was selling fast food, but not McDonald's, but sausages. And they lost the dispute in the court because their name was McDonald's, and they were sued by this large company. And as is usually the case, these large companies have a large suite of lawyers who come to the court and protect the right of the name, of the brand, of similarity, of analogy, whatever. So in a significant time period from 83 until 86, instead of fighting for competition, we had the struggle against competition. And until a period when someone realized that this was actually threatening the elementary rights not only of consumers but also of citizens. They needed consumers who do not ask questions but who buy things and do not say anything. But when this monopoly included two powerful areas, one was publishing, the books, and the other was software. So we have a very famous affair with a lawsuit against Microsoft. We realize that it is not the same thing whether you have competition in the production of notebooks or some toys or less important products. But when you have a monopoly and cartel-like behavior in an area such as the software industry, book industry, but also that which is called the media space, then the American society became concerned, and they went back to, they returned higher powers to this Federal Commission, which was supposed to deal with the protection of competition as one of the key and elementary rights and freedoms of the society, which, regardless of the fact that there is a market society, has to have some limitation, whether government is able to demonstrate its power by creating conditions for doing business where a citizen has the right to choose, but not to choose between a cartel agreement and a monopoly conduct. In Serbia, we have the situation where the Commission for the Protection of Competition is pursuing its procedures. And I'm going back to the start of my story. I hope that no one will will clean their stalls and show their spite in this way. Prime Minister Vučević and his associates are making an effort to make sure that his campaign does not affect only food and staple products, but also medications. Each of us can bear witness to this. I cannot explain why a medication which I use for my tender heart why its price has gone up by over 50% in one of the cheapest pharmacies in Novi Sad, where I regularly buy as a loyal customer. So I hope that this campaign will be responsible. I know that the government will not stop, but I hope that there will be responsible conduct by all participants in this procedure. We do not expect, by contrast, we expect the decline in the unjustifiedly increased prices of some products, but geopolitical tensions and, as Sava mentioned, container transport, global energy prices, oil prices is something we cannot affect, and this is what will always be included in the definition. So on the one hand, this is what we decide about, and on the other hand, which refers to the international environment, is something we cannot affect, but something that we can respond to adequately.
I will never stop believing in the fact that the good in people is bigger than evil, and that the responsibility to the surroundings in which you're doing business is at a sufficiently high level that even those who are not the subject of self-examination do conduct themselves responsibly, making sure that their profit is made on the turnover and not on higher prices. This is what we have been talking about all the time and always in the past. This is these are some traditional fundamentals of economy, the economy of scale, and I do not want people to tell me that the government will die out, but I believe that the government will always have to do its work and to make sure that this imperfect hand of the market is directed so as to ensure a sufficient number and amounts and types of products at prices that enable the survival of all these little industries that are important to all of us. I expect them to conduct themselves in a responsible manner, all of them. Radio Television of Serbia, a few weeks ago on the World Savings Day, banks said that they finally raised the rate of housing loans from around 16 to 25% in the portfolio, their share in the portfolio, thanks to the cap on interest rates. The interest rate was around 5%. What could the citizens expect next year, and how high could this rate be? Because I think they were quite glad to see that housing loans were disbursed again at this rate, because the rate used to be even as high as 7%. This is exactly what I had in mind when I said that the support of the financial sector is important for us and the government in terms of implementing all of these economic measures for which we have been given our mandate. What I can say is that as the year expires and as the measures with which we limited the growth of variable interest rate on housing loans also expire, I hope we will end all of these instabilities by adopting a new law which will limit all interest rates. As has been announced, I believe that it will be 5% until the end of 2025, as the President mentioned in one of his speeches. We will do all we can that this measure that will expire at the end of the year continues next year as well, and that this is something that both banks are pleased with, because they needed to know this in order to incorporate it in their budgets. Our colleague Bojan Terzic from the Consumer Protection Department and Darko in the Banking Supervision Department, we're all impatiently waiting for the law on budget and the set of accompanying laws passed through the parliamentary procedure, and then we will also enter the procedure with a set of our laws, and this one is one of the most important ones and of most interest for citizens. There will also be the law amending the law on banks, amending the law on the National Bank, because we haven't amended these laws for several years, but things are changing and we need to upgrade our laws with what has become our reality. So we hope that until the end of the year there will be no interruptions, that the legal procedure will be completed, and the citizens should not fear any. So the maximum upper limit will be 5% until the end of next year, and then we expect even the ECB's policy to ensure that the remainder of the adjustments of the market interest rate with ECB's rate should not exceed this rate even after 2025. Milica Rilek from Business RS. I also have two questions. I would like to go back to the inflation and GDP. I would just like to check with you, since when drafting the 2025 budget, the government took as macroeconomic assumptions 3.8% GDP growth rate in 2024, and 4.2 in 2025. And the annual inflation average of 4.7 for this year and 3.5 for 2025. I would like to check with you, is this the optimistic, the pessimistic, or the central scenario? What has the government opted for when it used these assumptions? I would like to say these are more or less the same projections, so deviations are minimal. The perception of the general macroeconomic situations, both of the government and us, are mostly alike. Maybe when they drafted the budget, they did not see the effects of the drought on inflation and fruit and vegetable prices, so maybe our inflation projection for the next year is slightly higher, but these are just nuances. There are no major deviations. I would just like to remind you that as for GDP for next year, we have a range of 4 to 5%. So 4.2% is merely a mathematical matter. We have a range, and we expect the growth to be within the range. As data come in, when this year ends, of course, for instance, in the February inflation report, we will come out with a more specific data as for our projection for 2025. So we have scenarios in the inflation report where you can see, where we analyze the impacts from the international market, higher prices of primary products, higher oil prices, where we always have these deviations both up and down, not deviations, but alternative scenarios. But we also did another alternative scenario with the effects of agriculture, where we took it as higher than what is in the report. But these are not major differences. These are more or less the same scenarios in both cases. I would say that we were both pessimistic and optimistic. Thank you. And the second question pertains to bank lending activity in a way, because domestic banks are becoming greater investors in this investment cycle. Recently, we published a story that commercial banks, for the first time, are among the 3 highest creditors of our public debt. We are increasingly reliant on domestic banks when it comes for loans, investment loans. So I was wondering if the National Bank of Serbia is keeping an eye on such bank activity to make sure that this is properly balanced. I would begin and then hand over the floor to Nikola. As for your first question, the government's estimate with which the finance ministry is coming out when it comes to adopting the budget. From the budgetary strategy through all the document that is adopted, the National Bank of Serbia is entitled to give its opinion, and our work is teamwork. Our autonomy and independence in choosing instruments to encourage economic growth and maintain inflation. This means that we are all working within our competences, but together by aligning all of these projections. We do not concede to one another, but we all have our stance, and that gives us all the best macroeconomic view and results in realistic projections. But they also have to be optimistic, because this is an encouragement for us to give our best and do our best. I would love that such cooperation exists in all other areas. what we have here in the National Bank of Serbia and the National Bank of Serbia with the government, and when they now go to the parliament before the vote on the budget, we will also go with the Fiscal Council, not to defend, but to present Serbia's budget for next year. So it is this coordination, our mutual coordination of our projections and policies. This is the reason why we will have the continuation of our cooperation with the IMF through the program called the Policy Coordination Instrument, which we have had twice already. It's a non-financial agreement. It has yielded results, and we hope that this will help us have this best possible alignment of and our optimistic view of future. You're asking us if we are keeping an eye on this matter. I keep asking myself whether, despite everything that we publish publicly, from the inflation report to all other press releases, decisions and materials, are we sufficiently transparent to the public if you, as a journalist who is dealing with the economics, you're asking us if we're keeping an eye. We're not only keeping an eye on all this, but we are identifying key functions in banks and working together with them. We demand from them, and then we verify their stress scenarios. How much is their key function how much it could affect the bank's stability? If it happens that a bank has not estimated one of its key functions, such as lending of a sector, purchasing securities, whether in dinar or FX, if they haven't assessed it properly, we calculate all that and we give them warnings. But we cannot, we have to show them that they need to see this as their key function, but to give loans to the Serbian government, Serbian state, is one of the safest jobs today for banks. This is a job that does not carry any risks, the weights for the government that settles its obligations regularly and to each cent is zero. So in a state of high liquidity, where channeling these investments does not mean that anyone else is being denied financing sources. The National Bank of Serbia knows this the best, because every Wednesday we hold repo auctions where we invest our liquidity, access, and for this they have an executive repo rate from us. So there are sufficient funds, definitely. When banks invest their funds in government securities, that means that they're not denying funds to anyone else. It means that they are investing in the least risky investment and that they have a sound profit from that. As to how favorable an investment target we are, is shown by the formal granting of investment grade that was valued through the issuance of our securities for more than a year back. And with this, in our textbox one, we have shown empirically how the investment grade is affecting the inflow of FDI as well as the willingness to invest in Serbia. So here's a good news to present to you. As of next week, we have been in the Citibank's report. Previously, we were in JP Morgan's report, but now Citibank is also publishing a report, and they have reported on Serbia and on our decisions. I was very proud to see this first report, because it seems to me that there hasn't been a more objective and impartial explanation of our keeping the key policy rate on hold, as was done by the Citibank. So this is not just something that you should ask whether we do it or not. This is our key function, that we should, on a daily basis, track what banks do and make sure that we maintain the stability of the financial system together with price stability. So who wouldn't want to invest in government securities if we have an FDI inflow into the real sector, which last year exceeded 4 billion, 4.6 billion, and the investment portfolio in which there's not a day of being late. So there are no restrictions, but you have given me introduction to say that no matter how well you do your job and how successful you are, when I read one interpretation of our last statement on the FX reserves, where net FX reserves have been reduced from 4.3 million euros, 4.3 million euros, because of our regular settlement of due liabilities, and gross reserves were increased by 8.3 billion euros. A title in one of the media said that our net FX reserves were reduced. They were reduced, but because we have regularly settled our liabilities, but nobody mentioned the fact that our gross reserves have been raised by 8.3 billion. I cannot I cannot control what media write, but my team and I can only be in control of the results that we achieve, and of which I am proud. I will always invite you to read about the results in which we have invested great efforts, with a wish to inform the public on what the National Bank of Serbia is doing. Nikola doesn't want to add anything.
You can say, I am proud that from one single foreign investor in our portfolio in 2012, Templeton, who could have rocked our ship with only 1 million euros in the market. Today, we have such structure of credible investors that you might think that I'm not being modest, but have you seen the press release that I am one of the 6 governors out of 191 governors in the International Monetary Fund? I was at a prestigious dinner with the first man of JP Morgan Chase, where I expected that will be asked some questions. It was my first time that as a representative of Serbia, I was present at such a dinner. No, we received information how JP Morgan Chase sees future development of the financial system, where are the niches for action, how to improve the inclusiveness of the financial sector, though I'm not sure that many understand that word correctly. And I was really proud by what is known, thought and considered and expected from Serbia. I have an impression that others know more about us than we want to know in our country. And ones that I have mentioned, inclusiveness, the Nobel Prize obtained for 3 authors, for 3 co-authors, for a paper on inclusivity, that the effects of the improvement of the financial system should be transmitted to all participants in the society, and not only to a part of an elite or lobby groups, which results in this division in societies which we have throughout the world, from the United States of America through Europe to the entire world. So this is the inclusivity, where the results and the benefits from the financial sector and its development need to be felt by all. But let me also mention that this Nobel Prize this year, which talks about the advantages of this inclusivity and the importance of institutions for this, is almost a paper copied from a paper published 15 years ago from a wonderful lady who published a book about how important institutions are, but also the people's awareness to apply the rules and the procedures that would benefit everyone. So equal opportunity for all. I apologize, but we see one another only rarely. So every 3 months when we meet at this presentation, I have a need to share with you some of the things that I have learned, some of the experiences that I've gained in the meantime. Thank you. When it comes to banks as participants in the financing of the Republic of Serbia's public debt, they are among our regular creditors, particularly when it comes to investment in securities. Here you have a difference between internal and external public debt. When we are talking about internal public debt, it makes up a quarter of total public debt. Banks regularly invest in DINA securities of the Republic of Serbia. As Governor said, this is one of the safer investments in their within the investment alternatives available to them. When we look at DINA securities, which is somewhat higher than 7 billion euros in DINA equivalent value, this is the total value of the securities that are currently issued. 60% refers to domestic banks. Only 16% refers to non-resident investment. So this is about 140 billion dinars, whereas other investors in these DINA securities are, that is 23%. We are certainly keeping an eye on their investments every day through primary auctions that are held by the Ministry of Finance, but also through secondary trading, on which we report on a daily basis, and we do not see any new tendencies. This is something that we expect to continue in the coming period. I will add another figure. Željko handed me a report on 30th of September. Government securities in the bank's assets were 11%. Loans to households were 24%, loans to corporates 27%, and those repo auctions I mentioned, the cash with the National Bank of Serbia. So this excess liquidity is 25%. If you do not manage to write this down, I will repeat: 11% government securities, 25% with the National Bank of Serbia, 27% to the corporate sector, and 24% to the household sector. So you need not worry. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.